Okay, you've got to see this. We're looking at the parallel passage of the healing of a leper, which we find in Matthew 8, right after the Sermon on the Mount, Mark 1, 40 to 45, so very early in Mark, and then Luke 5, 12 to 16. And we're just looking at some parallels here. I'm going to try to go quick over some detail stuff and then zoom in on a couple of more interesting spots. So, here right after the end of the Sermon on the Mount, you can see why Matthew would say after that, great crowds followed him. And then it goes, and there was a leper. And it says he came to him and knelt down before him. And then in Mark, it says a leper came to him, begging him and kneeling, he said to him. And then in Luke, it's interesting. It mentions here that it was in one of the cities. So I'm just going to make note of that because I think it adds some helpful color to the end of this little story. And then it also says there was a man covered with leprosy in Luke. So you get a little bit more, again, a little bit more color. This again is in the New Revised Standard Version, but I've got the Greek down here in my trusty NIV. Um, so it says the leper came begging, and it says when he saw Jesus, he bowed his face to the ground and begged him. So I think, not that I feel the need to necessarily harmonize everything, but I can see how you could kneel and bow your head to the ground, and those would be pretty compatible. I think it would be kind of hard to bow your face to the ground without kneeling, honestly. How would you do that? Face plant? Um, but let's move on here. So yeah, let me just make a note of that because that's interesting. Face to the ground is interesting in Luke. And then let's get down here to what the interchange here. So Lord, if you choose, you can make me clean. And then Mark, if you choose, you can make me clean. And then in Luke, Lord, if you choose, you can make me clean. So really, really close. Mark doesn't use the word Lord. What we see in verse 41 of Mark is interesting here. Moved with pity and I'm going to have to point this out, so buckle up for this. Moved with pity in the New Revised Standard Version, and that fits with this Greek down here, this splaginstes. Um, but what's very interesting to me is that the NIV has chosen to go with a different reading. If you come down here, it says Jesus was indignant. And there is a reading in some older manuscripts that basically use this like orgizesthai, this indignant. This is, you can see here, orgizo. And it is interesting to look at that word, but the manuscripts are a little bit later. And without having gone too deep here, the thought is a lot of times when there are different translation or different Greek manuscripts that don't agree with each other, um, one is to kind of count the manuscripts and see which ones have the most manuscripts. One approach is to look at which manuscripts are the earliest manuscripts. But then there's another kind of qualitative way, which is to say which one is more likely to have been changed kind of to help a reader later on. And I kind of hold that, as manuscripts were being copied, there could, if the readers were able to read Greek, which seems likely that, that's why it's in Greek and not a translation. These weren't necessarily going to seminaries. It was like people were reading this. There might be an interest in making some clarifications on what was being said here as language changes and stuff. I know sometimes there would be codexes that would have notes on the side, and that could be that there was a note on the side and that note became included. But so there's this idea that he had compassion. And so it says, or that he was filled with anger. Both are really interesting theologically, and neither one of them necessarily changes our view deeply in any way of who Christ was or how he interacted. He could have compassion for the man, anger about what was happening, what had happened to this man. But it becomes very interesting here. It says that he stretched out his hand and touched him. And then in Mark, it says Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him. And then in Luke, let's see, it says, then Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him. So those are the same. I do choose be made clean. I do choose these are all the same. Looking at the Greek down here, where in the NIV it says, I am willing, be clean. It's just simply here in the Greek, just these two words, thelo, I'm willing, katharistheti, be made clean, or be, it's like an imperative to be clean. Be clean, be cleaned, be cleansed. And then we see immediately his leprosy was cleansed. Immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. And immediately the leprosy left him. And then what's interesting here is the kind of the aftermath of the story. In Matthew, Jesus says to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priests and offer the gift that Moses commanded them." And then it says, "as a testimony to them." And the Greek there is, as you would expect, and you can see down in the bottom right, into marturian artuis, like as a witness or a testimony to them. And that same language is used here in Mark. I guess I was looking at Mark there, but here's testimony to them, testimony to them. What you get in the Mark passage is this extra sort of emphasis that Jesus sternly warned him and sent him away at once. Now, without again going too deep, this is another possibility of why we have a difference in moved with pity versus anger, because in this Greek text in verse 43, it's a binding sort of forbidding and a exebalen, that's an ekbalo, which is the same thing that would be used to cast out something. So sending him away is casting out. So it's possible, because it's not clear, it's not explicit who is being spoken of. So we assume in the way it's translated in English that he sent the man away, but it's possible that a scribe saw this as a binding of the demon that made him leprous and then cast him out. And that would explain the anger, possibly. Just a possibility. But he says to him, uh, yeah, so after the stern warning, so let's just look at that. I've got the Mark passage open with a stern warning, with a strong warning, and that's this binding. He cast him out. He sent him away, or sent him away immediately. See to it that you tell no one about this. Offer it to the priest. There's this whole thing from Leviticus 14 of how you were to go and make offerings. And just having glanced at the commentary for a second before hitting record on this, what's interesting and what's emphasized in all three of these passages is the testimony, or the witness to, potentially could be translated a witness against the priests. So, Jesus kind of makes a move on a chessboard here, and he wants to force the priests to either validate and sort of stamp with approval the cleansing that had happened to this man, that he was healed by the guy going through the procedure, or, or what are they going to do? Say he's not cleansed, his leprosy is gone. And that was the way Jesus instructed the guy to go forward. But we see that in Matthew, there's not like a follow-up of what the guy does, but in Mark, we see, but he went out and began to proclaim it freely and to spread the word, so that Jesus could no longer go into a town openly, but stayed out in the country, and people came to him from every quarter. So there's an importance in the story that this got everybody riled up, and Jesus had to move out of highly populated places, but people would come to him. And there's just a sort of a sense in the Gospels that Jesus is navigating the expectation, the red hot expectation that the Messiah would come, that he would bring liberation and power back to the Jewish people. But Jesus has to he needs time to develop his disciples in the downward journey, which is really important in Mark, that you must be servant of all, and that Christ predicts that he is going to suffer and be a ransom for many. And then, of course, in all the Gospels, the significance of the death of Christ on the cross. And so you can see that really in all the Gospels in different ways, that it's almost like there's a there's been a lack of rain, there's been drought, there's just dried tinder like this part of Texas can get, and it can be really windy and dry. Then the fire alert gets really high, and so there'll be burn bans. And it's like Jesus has to come in and do his work, but he wants to control the flame and not let it just go bananas and turn into uh, a political movement or to go be enthroned as king. I mean, we have a story in Luke, I think, where he intentionally like sort of just like vanishes on everybody and walks away from them. So that's going on here. And in the Lucan verse, we can just see it doesn't it doesn't say what happened, what the guy that the guy did anything wrong, but it just says now more than ever the word of Jesus spread. Many crowds would gather to hear him and be cured of their diseases, but he would withdraw to deserted places and pray. So that um, gives us some of the theology, some of the problems, and then some of the like socio-political, historical contexts for this story that's in Matthew chapter 8, Mark chapter 1, and Luke chapter 5.